Welcome to the Visible Art of Translation podcasts. This series of podcasts are part of the EU-funded INCREC project. Our focus is creativity, translation and technology in literary and audiovisual translation. Our goal with this series is to give visibility to the often invisible skills, role and voice of professional translators.
Today we're joined by Xanna Reddingius. Hi Xanna, so nice of you to be here with us today.
Hello, thank you for asking me.
Xanna Reddingius is an editor and translator of children's books. She has studied art history at the University of Amsterdam and has been working in the publishing industry for multiple years, mainly in children's literature. She works mainly in English to Dutch, and her translations include multiple books in the famous Little Golden Book series, The Chase, and multiple Disney projects. So welcome, Xanna. Thanks for being here with us.
Hi, thank you.
So we wanted to really start just how did you become a translator? How did you get here? So tell us a little bit about yourself.
I would describe myself definitely as an editor, first and foremost, and who got lucky to do some translations, mainly through work. I have been working at Rubinstein Publishing, which is a very small Amsterdam-based publishing company. I started there as an intern after studying art history. I just applied there for a position going, I would really love to work with books. I think I'd be good at editing. Would you give me a chance? And they did. And now I have been working there as an editor for the past 3 years. And because we're a very small publishing company, we do a lot of translating in-house, basically. Most of our editors have done some translating work. I have a colleague as well who is both a translator and the legal department. That's how I kind of also rolled into translating. As an intern, they let me translate My Little Golden Book about trains, which was a very straightforward non-fiction text. But recently I got to translate my first picture book that was rhyming text, which obviously presents its own creative challenges and fun. And yeah, that was just something I really wanted to do. So I asked the company to give me a shot at translating it. And they did. They gave it to me. So that was really fun. That was The Chase by Jenny Bloomfield.
That sounds very nice. So you mentioned that you got the manuscript you saw the manuscript for the English version and you knew your company was going to publish it and you thought, I would like to do this. Was that kind of the way that worked?
Yeah, so we did the acquisition of this book. Basically, the publisher saw it at one of the international book fairs and really loved it. And I think the original publisher was Quarto Group. And we did the acquisition for this book. And then, as the editor, I was given the manuscript of the finished project in English. And I asked if I could try my hand at translating it, because I really loved the text of it, and I thought that this was the kind of text where it allows for, slightly freer translation, but it's also still quite straightforward. So it felt within my scope to translate this.
And did you find, because you mentioned before you did the Book of Trains, the Little Golden Book of Trains, were there any unexpected things you ran into while translating a more literary book compared to a more like nonfiction book?
I think I just had two very different approaches to it, because with nonfiction, I think on the one hand, you stay closer to the text because the sentences are quite straightforward, so you can translate them a little bit more literally. And it's more about, it was very much about Googling, what the translations were for certain specific kinds of trains, like a freight train, what that would be called in Dutch. So that would be something that I didn't know beforehand. Yeah, then just looked up. So it was more about the specific words of that book that I had to translate. And then the sentences around those unfamiliar words were quite straightforward. It was very much like, this is a train and you go on it to go on a trip, and then you can go on a trip to Tokyo or London. Or actually the most difficult thing was the spelling of Tokyo, because we weren't sure if that had changed in recent years in Dutch, whether it's spelled with an I or a Y. What the rule of thumb is for that. So I just remembered that was one thing for that book. But with the chase, well, the first problem was, I suppose, the title, because the Dutch translation for the word chase is achtervolging, which is very long and not very appealing as a children's book title. And it sounds a bit sinister as well. It's more like, a police chase. You would use the word achtervolging, not for dogs chasing a ball. You would just say running after. And then you also don't want it to become like the hunt or something like that. So I think I just read through it, and then I was looking at, because the little girl who throws the ball goes ready, steady, go. And we also don't really have a one-on-one translation for that. We don't have a ready, steady, go. But we do have these phrases of like, are you ready? Here it comes. And then pakken means get it. And that is specifically something that you would yell or say at a dog for fetching something. And it's also something we in my family would always say to, like, if the cat was chasing after something, we'd be like, pakken, or pakse, like get it. And I thought that would just be really fun to use as the title, because it's a very active thing and it's short and it fits on the cover as well, which is always, a surprisingly important part of it. And then for the text itself, a lot of it is very phonetic words, very, active words that just describe what the dogs are doing. So the first thing I did was just compile a list of words that I associated with the same kind of things, but like running, jumping, and then I would look at which of these could rhyme. So I had hollen and rollen and dollen, racen, rennen, springen, draaien, hijgen, snuif, ruik, kind of finding the sounds of those words, pacing them together next to the original text, like, okay, what is happening in which spread, and which of these words that I compiled a list of could fit with these.
Oh, that sounds very interesting. And was this for you one of the translations you enjoyed the most? Did you enjoy kind of finding out what worked and what didn't work? Or was that also sometimes a difficult thing to figure out what to do and when and what worked best?
I think a lot of the book relatively easily, and then there were a couple of spreads that were a bit of a challenge. I remember there was one specific one that I dubbed over for a very long time. I kept going back and forth and trying to figure it out. And I also didn't want to reuse certain phrases, but like come on or kom mee was one that rhymed in lots of places. But yeah, it was definitely one that I really enjoyed doing, because like I said, I really wanted to translate something with a rhyming text, because I love with picture books that it's so much about the rhythm of the text as well, and that you have to really take into account how it sounds read out loud. And I think I have a feeling for like the rhythm of a text, and I really enjoy fitting that into the rhyme. So usually my process for like making something that rhymes, you have the rhythm, you have the length of the sentence, you have the end words which rhyme, and then you sort of retroactively fit the meaning of the spread into the sentences before it. I like that something like this automatically gives you a bit more freedom as well to choose your own words, because it needs to rhyme and it needs to have that cadence, which is more important than a literal translation. And then it's the fun of finding out how do I still like stay as close to the feeling and the meaning of the original text while adapting it. It's automatically an adaptation as well. I think that's what's really fun to me, just the puzzle of fitting things together. So yeah, I enjoy this more than a non-fiction text or something like my little golden book about Taylor Swift. As fun as that was to do, I enjoyed this more.
And have there been any instances, especially with the catch or pakken, where you thought you had a good translation or it was looking nice, and then you looked at how you would read it out loud or how it sounded, and you're like, no, actually, you know what? This sounded nice on paper, but when reading it out loud when in actuality, it just doesn't really work in that way. Or were you already so into that text that it kind of started flowing nicely anyway?
Well, first of all, it is called The Chase, not The Catch. I do remember that the spread that I struggled with the most is one that I have now translated in the end as In het water, op het water, wat een kabaal. wat zie ik daar? Eruit allemaal. But I don't remember what my first translation for it was. I do remember that was one where I was like, in the English text, it was about like in the water, on the water, wild and free. And then it was something about like, do you hear that noise? Come and see, or something. I don't really remember, but it was really hard to fit in because there were three things happening and it was foreshadowing the next thread where they reach like a big waterfall. And that was quite difficult to fit. And then there is one spread where we did discuss it because the dogs go down fire escape. And in the English text, it just says down, 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 down. Like it repeats like 5 times with an exclamation mark. And we did translate that as omlaag, which does not read as well out loud as down, like down, 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 down. Omlaag, 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 omlaag. But I did want to use it, and then it returns another time in the book, the down, down, down. And then in that instance, I translated it to there, there, there. So that was kind of like the compromise. That this one time we chose the meaning over the sound, and then the other one we changed the meaning slightly to give it a nicer sound.
I like this kind of balance idea between trying to balance both meaning and the way it was originally written and what works in the target language, in this case in Dutch. And I think it's a very nice example also of kind of using creativity and balancing this idea of both languages equally to make sure that the text retains its features while also making sure it works in Dutch. And in general, what do you think are the main difficulties you encounter when translating or working on a translation? Are these the kinds of things, or are there also other things you happen to come across?
Even as an editor, this is something that you think about and that you have to think about. But I do think about this, and also because I edit translations, and then sometimes for some books I haven't read, or actually I prefer to not have read the original text. And sometimes it's in a language that I don't know how to read, so I can't read the original. But then when I'm editing the text, I come across a sentence where I'm like, oh, I don't like this sentence. And then it's like, okay, but is it close to the original? Would I just maybe not have liked the original sentence because I'm not editing, the original work? Editing a translation is something very different. Yeah, the balance. And that is something that I also still find interesting, and that you have to rediscover every time and kind of reinvent. And it's interesting also to notice that it differs slightly for what kind of book it is. Like I talked about with rhyming, if you want something to rhyme, you're going to have to change the sentence structure. But also, we did a book about like art history for kids, which were very small bursts of text. And we also did one about the Ig Nobel Prize, which is like the Nobel Prize for silly scientific discoveries, which is really fun. And then you think about, okay, what is the purpose of this book? And it is, transfer of information in as efficient a way as possible. And for those kind of books, I think that the work that the author has done already is in the research and in writing the text, but more in the transfer of information. So I think in a book like that, it's more important to honor that than to honor the exact words that they use. Whereas with fiction, I would be much more inclined to hold fast to, specific wordings rather than with nonfiction, because the transfer of information is the most important thing. So for example, especially from English to Dutch, one thing that happens a lot is that you need to chop up sentences. And especially with nonfiction, I feel much more comfortable to rearrange sentence structures to keep the text as easily readable for the target audience, especially with nonfiction, as the original, because that is what the author has done and what their service is to the book. So in the translation and in editing the translation, I think it is honoring the author's work if you make it as easily readable in this new language.
And do you think you read translations in general differently because you also do your own translations, and as an editor, does that influence how you engage with these translations also in just everyday life, in your own life, in your own reading?
Oh, that is a fun question, because I was thinking before we started this about like that is pet peeve of mine. And for me, a bad translation is a noticeable translation. Even as like a young reader, I had that where you sometimes stumble upon something and you're like, this reads so strange. And then you translate it in your head to English and you're like, huh, that's where that comes from. So to me, I really, really dislike it. And it's funny because actually there was a book that I quit reading and it got a Dutch translation prize for the Dutch translation. I was like, oh, maybe it is me. But that book I really felt, but maybe the translator got the prize because they stayed quite close to the original text and they made creative choices in the sense that they adapted the Dutch language a little bit around the original to fit is as closely as possible. But to me, like as a personal preference, I don't like that. I would rather have a text that reads flawlessly in my own language than one where I keep thinking, oh, that's translated. That's what they said in English. Oh, that's what they said here in English. And like the worst example of this is obviously when they translate sweetheart as sweetheart, which is not a term of endearment that happens in Dutch. And this is a specific book I read as a teenager, and I remember, and I was also a sentence where they translated all right as like literally as al goed, whereas all right conveys reluctance and al goed conveys like it's fine. So that was an instance where it genuinely changed what the character was saying. And I see it a lot with subtitles as well. Dutch subtitles really annoy me because very often I'm like, no, that's not what they said. That's not what they said in the context. It's not how they meant it. I'm very much someone who wants to read the same story and the same intentions rather than the same words, which is why I mentioned earlier that I think a translation is always an adaptation.
Oh, that sounds very interesting. And I think it's an interesting take indeed on this idea of translation not just being about the words on the page, but also, or specifically, about the ideas behind it and the different ways of putting that down, and that it also depends on the book how much it matters in which way it's put down. And but talking about these different features of translations, different ways of reading translation and engaging with translations, we're also kind of talking about creative decisions and creative choices on the part of the translator. And now I'm heading towards the always difficult question of this podcast, because I'm going to ask you, how would you define creativity in translation? Do you have any ideas or feelings about how creativity works or should be understood in these contexts?
Well, I think some of it I already mentioned, but what I maybe like to add to that is that I think it's very interesting with translation is that you're really not just adapting from one language to another, but that a language itself is a complete framework. With translating to Dutch, you're translating for Dutch people, and it's a very small country, so Dutch people will have, grown up in Dutch culture or are very familiar with it. So you are also translating into a culture. So I think that is a really interesting thing. And well, because my experience with translations mostly lies with children's books, I think that the creativity there really is, to find elegant solutions and fun solutions to things that maybe seem very straightforward. Like one other translation that I did that I thought was that's still one of my favorites, even though it's a very small thing. It was a picture book. It was like a board book for not quite babies, but toddlers. So like 1 to 3 year olds. And it was really about the illustrations. But it was a French picture book, and it was called Je t'aime un peu à la folie. And then the sentence structure of it was like, it was a mom who was talking to a baby mouse. They were mice. And she's like, I love you a little bit. No, actually, I love you a lot. I love you grosse comme un éléphant, fort comme un ours, grand comme l'univers. So like, that is a sentence structure that works in French, but that does not work in Dutch. And even in English, if you translate it, it's like, I love you big like an elephant. I love you loud like a lion. And so we translated it as, I love you as big as an elephant, as loud as a lion. And it was a translation that we weren't really happy with, because in Dutch, ik hou van jou zo groot als een olifant, grammatically, technically doesn't make sense. But we were like, for the target audience, that doesn't really matter because the spirit of the book still stands. And if you're reading it to your kids, it's not like they're going to come away with worse grammar for it at 1 or 2 years old. But it wasn't great. it was that thing of like, well, it'll do because the drawings are more important. But then I remember at one point I like came into the kitchen because my publisher was there, and I was like, I think I got it. What if we do, I love you so much, and do you know how that feels? It feels big as an elephant, feels loud as a lion, because with feeling, you can link that in a grammatical way that makes sense. So it was just the adding of that little like, and do you know how that feels? That made the grammatical structure of the book make sense. And to me, those are the most fun creative solutions where it's like a very small change that makes it click.
And you were talking about children's literature, which makes sense because, of course, you work mainly on children's literature. Do you think there's a difference between creativity in translating for younger audiences and for adults? For as far as you can guess, of course, because you don't really do the grown-up literature, so to say. Do you think there is a difference there, or is that too difficult to say at this point?
I think it probably poses very different challenges. The main difference is the length, isn't it? Like just the length of the text, which means that I think maybe there's less middle ground of trudging through translating the bulk of a book, because specifically with picture books, maybe it's got more extremes. Like either you have something that requires a lot of puzzling because of the sentence structure and the puns in it and the rhyming scheme are so tight that it's like, oh my God, how do we translate this? Or it's very straightforward. Like you mentioned in the introduction, I've done some Disney books, and it's like, well, there's only so many ways you can translate, my name is Simba, I live in the savannah, this is my dad, Mufasa. You know, there's like, at that point, it's typing more than translating. So it's maybe a bit more of an extreme in that sense.
And do you use any tools or online features when you're translating or when you're editing a translation?
For editing, there's not really any. I mean, I use woordenlijst.org and onzetaal.nl quite a bit. Just the regular reference works, Vandalen for spelling and grammatical structures and Googling. And then for translations, well, in the publishing company, we use DeepL and Google Translate, but specifically as well for working translations. So these are not to be published, but when you want to offer a book, to the international market and have other publishers look at it and other publishers request it, because Google Translate is now so good. It's better that it's gotten in the last 10 years. We use it because before we had to translate it ourselves because there's not really a budget for making a translation for a book that has not been sold. The rights for it have not been sold to this other language. So we could only do like a couple pages or maybe one or two chapters, and it probably wouldn't be very good because it was just an in-house translation to English from people who didn't necessarily were translators. So now what we can do is translate the whole text to English and then clean that up ourselves, so that the foreign publisher has a much more well-rounded idea of the book that they're buying. So that's how I've used it. And for the very, very straightforward translations, like the I Am Simba book types of stories that I've mentioned, I would also use, I would prefer, I think, Google Translate to DeepL because it is more literal. Like there's less chance of it hallucinating things or adding things. Because like I said, my name is Simba. At that point, it's sparing you the work of typing the story rather than translating it, because there's only so many ways. And then I do go through it with the original text next to it and check all the translations. But I wouldn't do that, for example, with something like The Chase.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Also, it's nice, of course, that you can indeed offer now these potential books to new audiences in this way, in a clearer way for them also to understand. But of course, at the same time, you do see sometimes these machine translations being published or almost being published. There was the Dutch publishing company, Veenbos and Koning, who announced a couple of years ago at this point that they wanted to try to translate Dutch literature into English using AI. I not quite sure. I think they did mention they wanted to have someone go over the texts, of course, but there was a lot of backlash against this idea. I don't know if they went through with this. I think this was in 2024 or something. But this was this whole situation about translations of books being done almost only by machines and then being published in that way? And what do you think that the impact of machine translations and AI is on translations and on the publishing of translations?
Yeah, I definitely personally, I really don't like anything creative that is taken over by AI. I really don't like the impact that AI is already having on the publishing industry. I do also understand that it is a difficult market, and I do also know that publishing companies are struggling. But personally, I am more of the opinion of like, well, if there's no money to do this ethically, maybe we just should not do it. I'm definitely not, there's people who go, yeah, well, but this thing would just disappear if we didn't translate it with AI or publish it with AI or generate new content for it. And I'm like, well, I think personally that then maybe it should disappear. Not that it should, but like that if those are the options, I don't like that AI is the option. I think it's definitely won't result in better translations. And I think a lot of people are coming around to like a thing done badly, but done by a human is still better than a thing done better by a machine. I kind of like that. I kind of like that idea. I like that, you see that with arts and crafts. I do think that, a mediocre translator would have more of a right to be paid to do that than an AI would have. Not that an AI has a right to get paid to do things, which is the whole issue, of course. And I think one thing that translating with AI doesn't take into account is that process of adaptation that we were talking about, the process of cultural context, because you are taking you're not just translating words. That is what results in, I think, a bad translation, when you're not taking into account the context of something and how certain phrases land. And I also think that it is very important that we have translators who are, as their job, because these are people that are constantly thinking about our language. And I think, especially with a language like Dutch, which is in some ways, I think, disappearing. Like I know people our age whose vocabulary in Dutch is significantly like worse than it would have been if they probably didn't have access to all the English media that they have. And myself as well. I definitely use English words for things where I'm like, I should have used, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this podcast. I should have used a Dutch word for that, because there is a Dutch word for that, and you're losing sight of the beauty of those things and the fact that they have slightly different connotations. And translators are people who are continuously thinking about these things. It's not a given that we know the difference between this word and that word. It's not a given that we, as a society, as a collective, know what the exact feeling is of a certain word. We only know these things because we're thinking about them and because we keep using them. And AI translates things, then it's very easy for certain turns of phrases to disappear because they don't get translated as often, because it is more of a feeling than a literal translation. And I think Dutch especially also has so many like language quirks. We have a lot of filler words, and a lot of these things you don't think about. A couple of years ago, I was living with someone who was British and who was learning Dutch, and certain sentences he would be like, what do all of these words mean literally? And I had to translate 5 of them as a feeling or a concept, because it wasn't a word really. It denoted some kind of emotion, like maar, I think a sentence like, kom maar even bij. What do those words mean literally? Come, but, there, a second, by. What? But if you leave them out, it will have the same meaning, but it won't have the same feeling. So I think that cultural framework is very important, and it's very important that we have translators and people who are constantly thinking about and evaluating, like a living archive, basically, of what our language is.
And does that mean you kind of fear that this influence of machine translation can kind of remove these words, these kinds of words for feeling, and this knowledge about it? Or do you also fear that people just won't care about these things anymore because they don't interact with them as often as they used to do in the past?
I think both. I think, they're linked. I think you can't really have one without the other. It's a kind of vicious cycle, probably, where if you don't care about something, it's easier to use it. Like, it's the same with, I've had discussions about generating images, which is not what we're talking about here on this podcast per se, but it is interesting that, to me, it is inconceivable that someone does not feel a difference between those two things, like a human-made image and a machine-generated one. But I've had conversations with people who genuinely go, why does that matter? If it gives me the same, if it looks the same, if, in my opinion, isn't, but, theoretically. Or with the children's book, they're like, well, but if my kids enjoy it, who am I to tell them that they shouldn't? Which, on its face, I understand as an argument, but I do think that it is on the industry to care, even if the consumer doesn't, because you can't expect everyone to care about everything. It's enough that some people care about it, but they should keep caring about it.
That's a very interesting take and a very interesting perspective of it, because sometimes, of course, the argument is made that the industry, as an industry, cares mostly about its money and its revenue, and that it's simply, at this point, at the very least, cheaper to use AI to make translations, and that it's up to the readers and the people who are immersed in it and care about it, and perhaps even the writers themselves, depending on who you ask, that they should be up in arms against AI if they don't like it, or that they should make the argument with their money to not pay for these translations that have been using AI or make themselves heard in any sense. But I think it's a very interesting idea that it's the industry that should care specifically.
I do understand, the position that the industry is in as well, because and I think that is also a larger societal problem, and just basically capitalism. And I don't think it's on, the book industry to fix capitalism. That is maybe to call a mark. But basically, it is the same problem. And you do get a lot of smaller publishing companies do get eaten up by bigger companies, basically, because they're floundering and they can't afford the bill, basically. So I am sympathetic to that side. But that doesn't mean that it's not important and that we shouldn't talk about it.
And in general, what do you think? Do you think the reading experience is altered, is different for readers or even viewers of subtitles, what we are talking about before, when using machine translation only or largely?
I think yes and no. I think the strange thing with AI is also that it's often something especially with translations, I think it's harder to spot. I think for now, images are very easy to spot if they're made with AI. Still, especially like illustrations, that might change in the future. But with translations, I don't know that I could pick out a machine translated text from a lineup, basically. But I personally, like I said, I would rather be annoyed at a translation not being very good, but know that it was made by a human. But I do know that not every consumer will think about it that way. And I do think that the danger of machine translations are smoothing over the wrinkles and making everything more mediocre. Like, you'll get less of the really bad, but you'll get way less of the really, really good as well. Part of the research that has shown that it penalizes creativity, which, to hear that so specifically stated from a research point of view, that yes, AI does penalize creativity and it does avoid that, is quite validating to hear, I think, because it's something that we all instinctively feel about AI. Yeah, it makes sense that because it builds on itself. And the thing about creativity is that it is out of the box and that it is a little bit different than what you expect. It will change the reader's experience in the sense that they'll get less of translations that are genuinely interesting or that will make them think about language, or maybe everything becomes a little bit more dime in a dozen.
I think that's a fair assessment of the situation at times. I think it's interesting to think about this effect it can have, especially because it's difficult to sometimes pin down what the effect is, because sometimes these translations can be, as you mentioned, pretty good or difficult to keep apart from it. But we do know that they tend to generalize, that it becomes more of the same language-wise in the very least, and that it struggles with the more creative aspect and creative features of texts. So you really get this kind of smoothing over of language, but also indeed of creativity, which is, I think, very interesting and relevant to mention. And for our last question, we've been talking about this for a little bit and around it for quite a bit at this point. But for our last question, or very dramatic question, I wanted to ask, what do you think a world without translators look like if machine translation replaces professional across the board? What do you think such a world would look like?
Well, first of all, I personally think that it sounds maybe a bit silly as an argument, but I think there would be a lot of very sad former translation. And that's maybe not the right way to phrase that. But I think the fact that that is a job people like doing, that is very interesting and intellectually stimulating for people to do, is a good thing. That in itself makes it a worthwhile thing. And I think, because the argument is always like, yeah, but there are so many professions that have disappeared or have changed. And I think that this maybe should be one of the ones that stay, because it is stimulating in a way that nothing that you do in a like hobby fashion really would give you. And I also think that people would like doing it. But I think we need to take into account this cultural aspect of translation that we were talking about earlier, and this thing of adaptation. And the more I think about it, I think that is a very important thing of like, you have people with this like living knowledge of a language and a culture and the way that those interact, and the way that when you are translating, you are not just pulling on, it's not like you have a dictionary of one language in your head and you have a dictionary of the other language in your head. You also draw on all your experience in your life, all the books that you have read, all the literary frameworks, all the references to things. And an example actually from your research here was you put to me and some other people the question of which translation is better, and it was a couple different large language models that translated a piece of text, and it was about a boat and a pirate ship, and it had the flag with the skull and bones, and consistently the AI was like, you need to translate skull as schedel. And all of us, everyone who read the pieces, there was one where it was translated as doto, and we all agreed that out of context, schedel is a much more common word for skull. But in the specific combination of the skull and bones of a pirate flag, you would use doto. And that is a thing that is so cultural and so instinctive and so subconscious. And it's like, sure, you could say, what does it matter if we lose that difference between schedel and doto? The world doesn't hinge on that. I think that is an example of the fact that language is a subjective thing that is and should be part of our lived experience. And then translation is not just going from one word to the other, it's going from one cultural framework to another. It's important that is human work. And then, to bring it home, it's fun. It's fun to do. And it is really fun. And I do think that for the more difficult things to translate, something like poetry or a rhyming children's book, in that case, would be a much more, even though, for a human, it would be the other way around, maybe. Like, I think translating a novel would be a much more daunting task for me than translating a children's picture book. Like, I wouldn't say that I could just do that, translate a literary novel. Absolutely not. But if you think about what goes into translating a rhyming picture book in technical, like, mechanics for a computer, I think that might actually be more complex in a way, because it's different kinds of things that we as humans don't even really think about, that there are different processes that lock into each other. Yeah, and I think that it's good that we can do that, and that we should be able to continue doing that. And who knows, maybe with a world with all AI translations all rhyming children's books would be really, really badly translated. Or they wouldn't rhyme anymore. Or people would be like, oh, it's easier to translate them as not rhyming, so let's just do that. It's easier to, once you take that step to, let the machine do it, to be flippant about the outcome as well. Also because you don't have to take the feelings of the computer into account. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think it's a broad but interesting picture and worrying picture, perhaps, of what the world would be without translators. But I also like this idea about people always engaging in translation one way or the other and always liking the intellectual stimulating aspect of it that hopefully means people will continue doing it and continue being interested in language and playing with it and thinking about the cultural aspects of it all. But I think that's it for today. So thanks again, Xanna, for being here with us today and talking about technology and creativity and translation with us. So thanks that you were here.
Thank you. I had fun. I hope it made some sense.
I think it was great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you again to our invited speaker, and to our listeners. Thank you for being there, and feel free to share our podcasts with your family, friends, and colleagues. This is part of a series of podcasts of the EU-funded INCREC project. So follow us for more episodes, and please share your comments on this platform. See you next time.